Photographic Composition, Lecture 2, The Camera and the Lens, Part 3. We were just looking at an image by Stephen Shore. His closest photographic ancestor is Walker Evans. And Evans was also known for working with large cameras, in this case a 4x5 with considerable depth of field. He wanted to see everything crisply and in focus from the foreground to the background. The relationship between objects is of paramount importance to him, and as a result, he wants everything to be in focus. We also know that this is a fairly long focal length lens because of the compression of space. This will give you an idea of the discrepancy in sizes of sensors in DSLRs and also in larger cameras. Size is not everything, but in general, the larger the sensor in a camera, the higher resolution the images that it produces will be. As I say, this is changing largely because of the technology and miniaturization, which is allowing manufacturers to create higher and higher resolution from smaller and smaller chips. And this gives you an idea of what actually happens when light passes through the lens and strikes the sensor. Again, something that you don't need to know in great detail, but to understand at least basically what it is that's happening. And another illustration of what happens to the light after it passes through the lens. And Ansel Adams certainly is a photographer, or was a photographer, who was very concerned with resolution. He actually began a group in San Francisco called F64, and F64 referring to the smallest aperture possible on most view cameras. This is one of his most famous images of Yosemite. And as you can see, the trees in the foreground are very crisp and in focus. The mountains and the clouds are all also in focus. And he has a great deal of control over the process when he makes an image like this. And we can equate this to, because he's photographing on an 8x10, we can equate this to a sensor that is large and with a great deal of resolving power. Exposure. This is a beautifully exposed image. And we can tell that because the tones from black to white and everything in between emulate those that would be seen in reality. Exposed images have a range of tones that render detail in both the brightest and the darkest areas, which was also true of the Ansel Adams that we just saw. Virtually every photograph has an ideal exposure where the right amount of light strikes the sensor. This is a generalization, and there are certainly lots of examples of exceptions to this that we will be discussing. These are the basics of exposure in a nutshell. Three things determine exposure: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, or the sensitivity of the sensor at the time of exposure. If you adjust any one of these, it will change the exposure, and if you want to maintain the same exposure, but with that change, then other parts of the process have to be adjusted as well. If you are shooting with a particular aperture and you decide to stop down, for instance, making the aperture smaller, then you have to lengthen the shutter speed in order to compensate for it. This gives you an idea of what happens when you apply different exposures to a scene. These are all correctly exposed, but in the case of the first one, the duration of the exposure is quite long and the birds are just a blur. In the middle one, the shutter is open for a much shorter time, but still not short enough to really stop action entirely. And in the third image, it's at a high shutter speed, and as a result, the birds are frozen in space. And this gives you an idea of overexposed, correctly exposed, and underexposed. Of course, this is subjective, and there are times when you'll want to deliberately either overexpose or underexpose an image, depending on the effect that you're looking for. And with digital, in the last few years, there's a process that allows for the combining of information from various exposures called high dynamic range, or HDR. And what this allows for is much greater detail in shadows, much greater detail in the highlights, without losing one or the other. So they all end up in the same image, as you can see here. Now this is something that is actually affected by lighting, and required light in the foreground to be introduced in order to have great detail on this man and his wheelbarrow and his bananas, and while retaining detail in the buildings in the background which have direct sunlight on them. Otherwise he would be in very heavy shade and he would just be probably a black profile. Metering techniques. Meter close. When possible, meter close to the subject, then move back to take the picture. If the subject is against a light or dark background, an accurate exposure can be established by moving close enough to the subject to fill the frame, taking a meter reading, and returning to the desired point of view to take the photograph. This is especially true in interiors, as many of you may have already experienced, where there's a great disparity in light between the windows, which let on a lot of it, and an interior that may be much darker. Tilt the camera down. When photographing a landscape, the sky will often be much brighter than the ground, and an inaccurate reading will result. Tilt the camera down to fill the frame with the ground, take a reading, and tilt back up to the desired framing to take the picture. Exposing for shadows. When detail in the shadows is desired, fill the frame with shadow area, take the reading, and return the camera to the original position. Meter from the palm of the hand. Regardless of skin tone, most human hands are approximately 18% gray. Fill the frame with the palm facing the lens, take the reading, lower the hand, and take the image. There are also gray cards. More reliable than your hand is an actual 18% gray card. Place the card between the camera and subject, take a reading, remove the card, and take the picture. If the subject is in shade, tilt the card so that it is also in shade from the sun. Bracketing. Whenever the ideal exposure isn't clear, take several exposures of the desired scene while adjusting the aperture or shutter speed to create overexposures and underexposures. This will result in images with a range of tones affording more flexibility in editing later on. Meter program modes. Most newer cameras are equipped with program modes or scene assistants. These modes help both the novice as well as the professional to control the camera more effectively. Some common modes are B. The bulb setting, a holdover from the days when a shutter was depressed by a bulb connected to the camera by a thin air tube, is for long exposures. The shutter remains open until the button is released. M, for metered manual mode, suggests shutter speed and aperture combinations, but allows the user to dial them in by hand. P, for program, is an automatic mode with several limited user controls. Little experience or thought is necessary. TV, time priority mode, allows the user to choose the shutter speed and the meter provides the appropriate aperture. AV, aperture priority mode, allows the user to choose the aperture and the meter supplies the shutter speed. Many cameras also feature a fully automatic mode denoted by an empty rectangle that requires virtually no thought at all. These are scenes that are particularly difficult to meter. As mentioned, facing the being in a relatively dark space and facing bright windows. The meter will look at those windows and say, oh, you have plenty of light, and you would end up with a very dark image which would not show the nice detail that we see in the bar and virtually everywhere else other than the windows, which are now blown out. And this has sort of a similar effect, although it's very difficult to really look at, let alone know how to meter. This is a good opportunity for bracketing, which I had mentioned earlier. Here's an example of deliberate overexposure. Richard Avedon, who was technically very accomplished, made a decision to deliberately overexpose this image. And at the same time, he was using a very small aperture, a very large aperture, which kept the boy in focus and threw the tree and anything else that could be seen out of focus. Here is also a difficult metering situation where, as with Avedon, W. Eugene Smith was interested in seeing detail in the, especially in the face of this worker with an extremely bright background. And here Lee Friedlander is doing one of his many self-portraits. And this is a bit of a metering nightmare because he not only wants to show the bulb, but he wants to show his face beyond it. So this is probably a bit of an experimentation that happened to work. This is an early advertising photograph made in the 50s by Bert Stern, who went to the pyramids in Egypt to photograph a glass of a martini, of vodka martini. The lighting was high contrast. There's quite a bit of sky, but there's also a lot of shadow areas. And then there's the martini itself. Glass and water are notorious for being difficult to get effects from and to balance with other objects around them. In interiors, it's often very difficult to balance the light inside with the light outside. And in this instance, Peter Aaron, who was a very accomplished architectural photographer, has most likely introduced lights specifically to light the interior in order to balance the exterior and the interior light. And the same thing here, but very different kind of light. It was essential to this image being effective that there be detail in the water and the sky outside, as well as nice detail in the chair and the small table. And this meant probably some supplementary lighting, but also waiting for the right time of day when the sky became dark enough and balanced more naturally with the interior light. And basically the same thing going on here. These kinds of exposures generally mean waiting until conditions are just right. And dusk only happens once a day, so you have to plan accordingly.